yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery, but today is a gift.
It is not our abilities that show what we truly are. It is our choices.
Hello and welcome to Jen Taylor Rerouting, where being rude is never acceptable, but sarcasm is welcome and swearing isn't always a bad option. Let's get started. Welcome to Jen Taylor Rerouting. Today I am really blessed to interview Karen Gedney. Karen, how are you?
I'm fine, Jen. How are you?
I'm awesome. I have been really looking forward to this interview. This is one of those, it may seem deep, dark, and we're talking about stuff that lots of times people don't talk about, and I'm so thrilled in your willingness to share your story. So one thing we need to know about you, Karen, where did you grow up?
I grew up actually right next to Woodstock in New York. It's in the Catskill Mountains. I grew up in the 1950s to German parents who had never completed high school. So they dragged me basically skiing and hiking. And that's about all I did for my first 18 years living with them.
Really?
Really.
What did they do for work?
Well, my father was fortunate enough to start in IBM in the 50s before they were concerned with degrees or GEDs or anything. He started initially with the huge vacuum tubes in computers as big as buildings. And he worked himself all the way up to be a systems technician, and in the 70s being transferred to Silicon Valley, to California, San Jose plant. My mother was a waitress when we got a bit older. And when she was skiing in her 40s, she snapped off both tibia and fibula above the boot line, both legs. Yeah. When I was about, when I was turning 18, and I still remember I was skiing with my mother, and she started crying that I wouldn't be able to go to college because she couldn't earn any more money as a waitress.
Wow. Very different mindset, huh?
Yes, where their issue was always focused around having enough money to do the things that my father wanted, which was he wanted to ski, and he wanted my sister and I, unfortunately, to play the accordion growing up.
Wow. Okay, that's a painful memory.
Yeah, that was for my sister and I. We that was not our thing.
So you ended up going to school, and you're a doctor. Tell me how you made that decision and a little bit about that.
Well, I must say I was very much affected by the books I read, because we lived way out, in the boony lands, and my parents also had a lot of, especially my mother, a lot of fears about interacting with people. So we never really played with other children. We never went over, for birthday parties or sleep. I mean, never interacted really with other people. And so books were my friends. And I was affected by books, especially books written by Frank G. Slaughter, who was a physician. And I romanticized about being a doctor and doing all these cool things. And he wrote about doctors throughout history. And I liked the danger and the intrigue and the excitement of learning new things. And I was 9 years old. I didn't have any experience, and that just sounded like something that's what I wanted to do.
And you did. You became an MD. You were a physician. Was there any specialty or anything like that?
Yes, I have a board certification in internal medicine. That means I'm the one who figures things out and looks at the whole person figuring it out, and then giving treatment to complex medical problems.
Wow. So was there danger and intrigue? Like you thought?
There was in prison, yes.
Yeah. So, okay. So first, because that's like, once we go there, we're sunk. We're there. So right now you have a business called DRG Consulting,
Right.
author, speaker, and mentor. And you really, I mean, being a doctor in internal medicine, looking at the whole picture, you really want to make a difference to people.
Correct.
And so you also have a memoir, 30 Years Behind Bars. It's a Trials of a Prison Doctor, and we're going to get into the prison. It just came out on Amazon last month, so 30 Years Behind Bars, and we'll have a link to that. And so that's a huge part of the story we're talking about today. So, but so that's what you're doing now. So now with DRG Consulting, what's the biggest thing that you do? What's the best thing you do? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I think that the best thing I do now is learning a entirely new career path for me. And so I'm in my 60s now, just turned 61. And it's one thing to do all your training in medicine and then be a doctor, and you do 30 odd years in your career. And then you can choose different things, especially if you're a state employee like I was. You can retire and then just play golf and live below the radar line. Or you can do something that tests you and pushes you so you grow and you learn and you have new adventures. And when I must say, when I retired, I was a little bit unclear what adventures I wanted. And I ended up getting a new certification in medicine out of interest, which is anti-aging and regenerative medicine. And then I also felt that I had this book in me that I had to write, one of those bucket list things. And also throughout my career, I was told when I would tell people some prison stories, they would go, "Oh my God, Karen, you have to write a book." And I heard that an awful lot. And I had kept notes and I kept journals and I kept inmate writings. And after 30 years, I sat down and I looked at it all and I thought, that is a lot of stuff. That's a lot of shit in those files. But how to put it together and have any flow, I realized that it truly had to be a memoir, something that was true, and for the outside world to see the prison through my eyes, naive, someone who really didn't know anything about prisons. I mean, I never knew anybody who had really gotten in trouble with the law, or I didn't know anyone who had an addiction problem. I mean, I was about as naive as they come.
Right.
So I wanted them to see it through my eyes and also see it through the eyes of someone who's trained to diagnose and treat complex problems. Many times people just see it from one little niche. Mm-hmm. Could be just the little medical niche, custody niche where, okay, my job is just to keep you locked up in a cell and not be compromised. Or you have the niche where some people feel it's their piece to make an inmate's life more miserable than it is because they have a sadistic quality or a very vengeful retribution quality. So there are all these different niches in the prison.
And you got I love that you did it as a memoir from the lens, your own lens. I think that's probably the most raw and true way to have written the book. So that came out, you got your book out. I want to go back a little bit. And you actually got into working as a physician in the prison system, which is very unique in and of itself, for a program for medical school scholarship. So tell me how that happened and that you got in and how you felt about even getting into the prison. I mean, like you said, you were pretty naive. So, but tell me a little bit about that.
Well, because I had parents who really didn't have excess money at all. And when I grew up, I was always told, okay, you can be what you want. but we're not going to give you a dime. At 18, you are on your own. And I realized that, at least I was bright enough to realize that there was no way I could afford that unless I did it on scholarships. Right. And that meant I had to always excel in anything I ever attempted in school. And fortunately, I like to learn. And a lot of the things I learned, I actually liked. I mean, I truly liked science and math, which many people do not. I got a scholarship to college. And then after college, I applied to medical school. And even though I was, up there in the top couple of percent in my college, I didn't get in because this is back in the 1970s when getting into medical school was incredibly competitive, and you're competing against all these bright people who have connections, parents who were doctors, parents who know people on the medical school board and know how to, let's say, present yourself in a way to get into a spot. So it didn't happen for me the first year, and I was crushed. But I have that stubbornness like my German parents. And I decided, okay, now how do I get in the next go round? And I decided, well, I will get more education. So I went after taking master's level classes at that time in San Jose University. And I ended up being a bacteriology nighttime supervisor for Los Gatos Laboratories. And I ended up working in a medical office. So I hit every little bell that I could think of. And I did get into the following year, the University of Cincinnati. And I thought, now how am I going to pay for this? Because in those days, even in those days, it's like $100,000, like 1980, it was like $100,000 and my father would not co-sign a loan or anything like that. And so I started looking around for scholarships, and thank God I applied to the National Health Service Corps scholarship. And that was probably one of my happiest days in life, where I got literally a telegram. That's the days of the telegram.
That's awesome. People
like
are
Morse code or something.
What is that?
Yeah, where I was told, you've got a full ride to medical school and a stipend to live on. And my parents weren't home, so I couldn't even, tell them. But my sister and I celebrated. I remember that. I have a sister 1 year younger than me, and we were both in San Jose, staying in their place at that time, visiting, and we had that was wonderful for me. And the kicker is, after you complete medical school, you are allowed to complete extra training, which is the residency in internal medicine. But after you've finished your specialty training, you owe the government 4 years of your life, wherever they want to put you. And the National Health Corps was to put you somewhere in the United States that really needed doctors. And that's what I always wanted to do as well, just serve where I would make the most impact. Now, I thought it would be indigent clinic or a Indian reservation or out in the boonies. And then they told me, no, you are going to a male medium security prison.
Wow.
Because Nevada at that time was under lawsuits, and their governor had petitioned the federal government, and they needed someone to plunk in the prison, and I was one.
In the meantime, you met Cliff.
Yes, my baby, my soulmate.
Your soulmate. I have a lovely picture of the two of you. And you two, how did you meet? I know you knew each other a year when you got married, and that was before, right before, like 2 months before you started working in the prison. So he is happening at the same time as all of that's happening. So tell me how he fit in.
Well, that was absolutely sheer luck. And I met him in a bar, Jen.
All right.
And I was here I was, at that time, I was a chief resident. So I was in charge of residents. In fact, the program I was in, they couldn't find a chief. So I was a third-year resident and took on the chief position as well. And I was working so many hours, it was just ridiculous. And for months, I would be working with never a day off, 100-hour type work weeks. I mean, it was ridiculous. But that particular weekend, that's why it's serendipity, that particular weekend, I found out that I would have Friday night off and a full Sunday. I mean, a full day off. It would be my full day off in months. And I was almost giddy from the thought of, oh my God, having a day off, a night off. And so on the way home, I decided I'm going to just stop by this Mexican place and have a little snack and dance, because I like to dance, just to celebrate my excitement. And that's when I ran into Clifton, where it's sort of a funny story where when I walk in, there was someone from the hospital who knew me, and then we walked in together and we sat down at this big table where there were other people, and Clifton, who is a very good-looking black guy, is sitting next to me. In fact, he's a mutt mix. He's Black, Cherokee, European. You see what I mean? So
Holy cow.
Yes, he's got the mutt mix look. And he was sitting next to me, highly intelligent, which I have always been attracted to. And also when we were speaking, he was telling me about after grad school being in Vietnam and shot through the chest in '69 and losing a lung. And in my mind, of course, I'm calculating his age. And he did not look that age, right? I mean, he just did not look like he was in his early 40s at all. I thought he was more like my age, like 30. And so I said to him, hey, how old are you? And he said, well, you don't know me well enough to ask that, but on Sunday, it's my birthday. Now he was, yeah. See, so he was new in the area, totally new in the area. He had, was living in an apartment, and he had sort of had a home in California. And so, and he was going to move to Nevada. And he ended up walking me to my car that night. And then it came out of my mouth, well, would you like to come to my place for dinner? And when he did, I said, and then he was like a stray dog. He never left me.
That's what did it, huh?
And and also you'd have to imagine, some women, I don't know, dream about marrying or getting kids, or that was zero for me. I mean, an absolute zero. It never occurred to me that I would ever marry. It was always like, be a doctor, do this, do that step, doctor. Never did I ever think about it. And when I interacted with Cliff that night and we just were talking over dinner, I had this realization in my head, that's the guy I'm going to marry. And it had never occurred in my life. Just sort of like when I was 9 years old, and it just occurred to me, I'm going to be a doctor. It was not one of those things like, well, is that a stupid idea, or where'd that come? I just knew. I've only known twice in my life, and both were thankfully home runs for me.
So you guys met. Now, you mentioned that he's mixed. So he's a black man in Nevada.
Yes, right.
And this is, to give reference, you guys met in '86 and you married in '87.
Yes.
So this is 1987. I'm just a little bit younger than you. I graduated high school in '88. So I grew up, I was born.
I graduated in '75. Yeah, so 13 years.
So, and I was also from New England. Now, you weren't in New England at this point.
No.
So then I don't know what it was like. But there still is, but definitely back then, there was prejudice. And when you had a mixed marriage, there was prejudice. So what did you guys experience with that?
Well, it's sort of interesting because I never really, for me, uh, I didn't experience racism because there were no Black people, right? So,
Yeah,
but,
no, there weren't.
I mean, there weren't any, and also I enjoyed watching Sidney Poitier in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and To Sir with Love. In fact, I must have had a crush on him. I mean, I truly did growing up, just watching those movies. But when we met, and then when we moved to Carson City, Nevada, that's the state capital, maybe 40,000 people back in those days. There was no Black people. I mean, really, none. And so I have to share with you like a funny story. And imagine Clifton's outside of our home, and he's putting in the sprinkler system.
Oh no.
You'd have to imagine this. It's really great. So he's putting in the sprinkler system, when he's in his, whatever, sloppy clothes out there. And I'm outside and I see this car pulling up, right? And there's this old guy and he rolls down the window and he motions Clifton over. He goes, hey boy, how much you charge for doing the yard work? And so Clifton, he comes from a very different background, let's say an elite background. And so he sort of slouches forward, he sort of scuffles back. He goes, mister, I just sleep with the lady in the big house. and so this is the sort of thing that, I mean, I don't know, I had a lot of fun because one, Clifton is unique in that he grew up in a very rarefied atmosphere with highly intelligent parents, grew up in Hyde Park in Chicago. So he interacted with people when he was a kid, like Milton Friedman, Malcolm X, Jackie Robinson. His mother was an international pianist. His father was a real estate mogul. Now, mind you, his father lost his fortune when he was 17, but all his formative years, he thought he was probably a rich white child with a good tan. I don't know. and living in a university atmosphere, I mean, his neighbors were the Florshimes, which is, whatever, a shoe dynasty legacy, right? And so he does not operate from a poor me or a victim because he never was. He was always an elite. And in Vietnam, he was a platoon leader. Right. When he was drafted, he took the tests and whatever they do, and he went to officer training, schools in Panama and that sort of thing. So when we would have funny interactions, here's another one. We were invited to the governor's ball in Nevada. And this is Governor Miller, way back, in the 80s. And Clifton's standing, late 80s. Yeah, Clifton's standing next to me. And, this is the Republican thing. So there's nothing but white people there, right? Except the entertainment was a Black group. So Clifton's standing next to me. I'm talking to the governor's wife, and the security people come up to Clifton and say, your set's starting. And I was like, Cliff, go up there and sing. Do it.
Oh my God. It's really good that you guys have such a great sense of humor about it, because prejudice is a very awful thing. And I'm blonde hair, blue eyed. So you
right.
think, oh, no big deal, right? Except I lived in Hawaii for a couple of years back in 1990, and they hated me. I have never felt so much venom. And I grew up in New England.
Right.
We were raised with no prejudice ever against anyone. And I think that's because it was such a melting pot. You were German, right? I grew up in a Portuguese neighborhood. the Italian mob was very real. You didn't have prejudice against anyone based on their culture or their skin. And so then when you go out in the real world and you feel that, that is a horrible way to feel. And so I'm glad you guys had such a great sense of humor, because it wasn't common back then to be Black in Nevada, but also to be a multiracial.
Right. No, it
That's
wasn't. You
fantastic.
know, we had times where we would walk into restaurants and it'd be like a movie. People would be bringing their spoon of soup to their mouth and would, in, you know, mid motion, just stop and stare. Their spoons just in front of them. But see, I don't know. My father, I think, my father had traveled around the world as a merchant marine for 13 years before he married. And he had a very unusual sense of humor and a way of looking at the world.
Mhm.
And so I had part of that in my personality, and then weird fears from my mother's side. But I almost enjoyed shocking people a little bit, you know, because because people would come over and, you know, sometimes they'd be trying to, I don't know, say things to make a conversation about gardening or doing something in the backyard. And I would joke and say, well, Clifton does not like doing yard work, which is true, he doesn't. But then I would add, because he's always worried I'm going to plant some cotton back there, right? And their eyes just look like, go up like, oh my God,
Oh my
what'd
God.
she say? You know, but I would do that because I like to, I had that streak in me, right?
I love it. And I love that we talked about this first. So you marry in 87, you have this scholarship 4-year thing. So you started working at the prison a year, like 3 months after you guys
Right.
got married. So here you are, funny as hell, but naive about, certainly about the prison system, which I think the majority, and you would probably agree, the majority of us are ignorant or naive about
Right.
the
I mean,
prison
we
system.
see TV and movies and, you know, you come up with your own ideas, but it's very different when you're on the inside.
Right. Now, I know the incident that you wrote about in the book and that we're going to talk about in more detail was about a year and a half after. So just lead me through some of that, some of the what it was like to work there, and then just dive right in to the incident is
Oopsie.
outstanding.
So, um, so I start, and it was complicated because when I started, the medical director, who would have been above me at a state level, within a few weeks, I found out that he was dying, and then before long, he was dead. So I had no one to ask for any help
Okay.
at all, which is not good when you're thrown in and you don't have like a supervisor or anyone telling you. My first day on the job, I show up and they treat me like, well, they're not happy to see me. Let me put it that way. And then the nurse who was in my clinic also did not seem to like me there. And she was like, well, so and so will just show you around. And, you know, I shown around by this guy in blue scrubs like most of the day. And no one tells me that he's an inmate. You see what I mean?
Wow.
You see, I mean, that sort of thing where you try to get in your brain, like, how can you do that? But even worse, like he was the nicest person to me. You see what I mean?
Yep.
Right? So that was another weird thing. And then when I, you know, come back into this clinic area because he's been showing me around, some other nurse says, you know what he is? He's a chomo. And I didn't even know what that meant, right? And then he tells me he's a child molester. You see, and it was so unprofessional. One, to not let me know that I was walking around with an inmate. Two, that the inmate never really volunteered it either, you know what I mean? And then 3, for someone who's technically supposed to be professional, embarrassing that person who actually works in the clinic. I mean, he was a worker. And in the early days, that was another thing that floored me. In the early days, the majority of the people who worked in the clinic, the medical clinic, were inmates. I had an X-ray tech who was an inmate. My guy who helped with emergencies and guys that went down on the yard was an inmate. The guys who would be the clerks and sign in people and take blood pressures and pulses rates were inmates. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I was surrounded by all these individuals in the clinic who were working, who were actually inmates. And actually, I liked them the most, you know, actually, because we had some very unhappy, angry, disgruntled staff. I mean, you know, there were some nurses that, to me, I think they gravitated toward the prison because they liked power and they were not compassionate people, you know, so in their minds, the prison fit for them.
So not a great
Start.
setting, right? Yeah, definitely not a great start. So jump right in, because this is quite a story.
Yeah, so what happened was a year and a half, I start taking care of all sorts of medical problems. And there was one particular inmate who was a Marine Vietnam vet who was highly intelligent, who had some minor medical problems, but more than anything, it was obvious he had psychological issues, a lot of depression and a lot of on the edge of suicide. And in those days, we really didn't have like psychologists and psychiatrists. And we had one guy that this inmate would not associate with at all because the psychologist was a draft dodger who only said things like, well, what do you think? Well, hey, what do you think? But really did not care. So the inmate had nothing to do with him. And I'm faced as a naive person. Well, he's got medical problems. He has psych problems. I'm a doctor. I have to see if I can help him and heal him. That guy developed literally like a fatal attraction toward me. And I knew he was getting attached. And I was in this position of, what do I do? Do I try to, if I tell custody, because I saw how custody overreacted, they tended to overreact with things like that to make the person even more miserable. Like, oh my goodness, the doctor thinks you like her, so we're going to take everything away you have, put you in a higher security place, beat you up, you know, that sort of mentality. So I thought, I have to figure out how to do this on my own. That was a bad mistake, because I didn't trust anybody on the other side, because I had seen a little bit too many things by then. And then this guy on Friday, October the 13th in 1989, basically took me hostage. He came into the clinic that day. He brought in a lot of stuff with him, a buck knife, not a make-believe knife, but a real buck knife. He had torn up T-shirts, made ropes out of it. And no one actually searched or, you know, looked at him when he came in. He sat down and he said, Dr. Gedney, you know what day it is today? And I said, Friday, October the 13th, and a little fur, you know, goes up on your neck. And he said, and that's the day you're going to watch me die. And when I tried to get up to get out of my room, he basically took me down by force. And because he was a Marine trained killer person, he, by reflex, took my neck and rotated it literally around my head, you know, to stab my neck. And fortunately, I was athletic enough that I went with the force, ended up on the other side of my desk, upside down. He shoves the heavy desk into me. And then it gets complicated because he's yelling, and I hear, because this clinic is small, it's right next to where the lieutenants and the associate warden's offices are on another, past two like steel gates, but it's close. And I hear, and I'm like dazed upside down because I think I broke my wrist landing on it wrong. And I hear the associate warden at that time yelling down the hallway, "What's going on?" Blah, blah, blah. And the inmate says, "I've got her hostage." And that guy goes, "What do you want?" And the inmate says, "That bucket of water," where they had those plastic jugs of water, plastic jugs of water on the counters where the nurses would dispense little medicines. And that assistant warden basically, because when I'm trying to come up front of my desk to see what, he hands the guy the plastic jug of water. Now, he could have done something at that point in time, possibly, because he would have had the goon squad behind him. But he didn't do anything. The inmate takes the jug of water, and then he closes the door and locks it from the inside. Now, this is how prepared the prison is. The prison doesn't even know if they have a key to even get into that door. See,
Oh my God.
I'm not kidding. That's how bad that place was. You know, and now I'm hostage with this inmate who, one, has a fatal attraction to me, but also has a death wish. All right, has a death wish. Then it even gets more bizarre, because in the hostage, back and forth business on the phone, turns out that the sheriff in Carson City was this inmate's best friend.
What?
Yes, they had grown up together as kids. I mean, you can't even make this stuff up in a movie. And they end up calling the sheriff in to be part of the negotiation. And, the inmate basically tells his old high school friend, "Hey, I'm not going to tell you anymore. I'm not going to interact with you." And it was about 4 hours before he actually ends up raping me. And that was one of those things where, the tension in the room was just building up unbelievably. And he made it very clear it was going to happen, and it was going to happen whether I was dead or alive. And I decided I'd rather be alive than dead. And I must say, I ended up literally, my brain just switched off, because I have a thing about wanting to be in control, or at least the illusion of control. And I knew that he would want to get off on me emotionally, having a reaction, whatever reaction that was. And so I shut off all of that like a switch, and I showed zero, absolutely zero. And after he raped me, then the energy in the room was just like a balloon that just had all the air went out, And then he had brought with him marijuana. He started smoking marijuana and eating junior mints. He had brought junior mints with him, and Maalox. And unfortunately, he was a nicotine addict, so he had a carton of Camel cigarettes too, oh God. So, but when that tension broke, that was much better for me than sitting on that edge was like, I can take him. No, I can't. Because up until that point, I was playing in my mind, can I take him? And I knew that if I took him, I would have to totally 100% incapacitate him.
Yep.
And he had a buck knife and was a trained killer in Vietnam. And then my brain was like, what are you, crazy? He has nothing to lose. And even if he didn't want to kill you, he's going to kill you on instinct, right? In fact, he was in prison because he had done armed robbery, and a cop, stopped him. And basically, he literally, what should I say? He ended up disarming a policeman and killing him. See what I mean? I mean, he was a trained killer.
And he had a death wish, like you said. I mean, he wanted to die that day.
Right. So he didn't want, there was no bargaining.
No, you would have to kill him or knock him
Right.
unconscious. Yes,
Right.
absolutely.
Right. And so that, and then it was really so stupidly bizarre. He had, when he came in to see me, he had put like a little bullseye on the door, and he was telling him in the interrogation, literally at the stroke of midnight, because he wanted to be killed on the 14th year anniversary that he had killed the police officer. So he was very intelligent. So then it became almost like weirdly like a Hannibal Lecter tale because he wanted to be killed on the 14th anniversary. That would have been on midnight, the 14th of October. He had planned it, so there were 14 visits. That was my 14th visit. You understand? Everything was planned way before.
Holy crap.
There are 14 letters in my full name. I mean, then I started seeing 14s everywhere afterwards. And I only found out about this weird thing with the 14 business really after, when one of the inmates thought he was dying and basically told me that he knew Mellor was going to do this years ago, that he wanted to die on the 14th anniversary. And, he felt like guilty, that he should have seen it coming, that sort of stuff. So it was very bizarre, very bizarre.
So he's smoking weed and cigarettes and eating some Green Mints after raping you.
Yeah.
That's normal.
Yeah, that's right.
And you're like 5 hours in at this point?
Yeah, now I'm 5 hours in, and I still got another 6 hours to go before they finally had a SWAT team. And during that period of time, there's no movement on the prison yard. I don't hear anybody. I swear, I thought that everybody went home and just left me to die. I mean, that's what I thought, And then my poor husband, imagine Clifton, they call him, because he was working at a little company at that time. They called him and said, come to the prison administration, your wife's been taken hostage.
Holy shit.
Right. And so he had to come, and he had to sit there for 10, 11 hours waiting.
Knowing you were hostage.
Knowing I was hostage. But also he knew, before it happened, I had actually talked with Clifton about this guy, because, they're both Vietnam vets, right? And I had told him, and actually my husband had warned me. He said, Karen, he's dangerous. He's a Bush vet. And I said, well, what does that mean? And he goes, he's never come back from the war. Be careful. I wasn't careful enough. So he's in administration, and then the people in power would intermittently come in and tell Clifton what was going on, okay? And then they would also ask him, well, what if we do this? What do you think she'll do? Like initially they thought, could they bring in coffee that was drugged, or, I mean, he wouldn't take anything, and there was no way to give that sort of stuff anyway, but they were figuring different scenarios. And they even told Cliff, well, we're thinking about using a concussion grenade, and it could make her deaf. And I'm thinking, all right, forget it. But So they were running these different scenarios. Thankfully, they didn't make me deaf. They gave me ringing in my ears for the rest of my life, but didn't make me deaf.
And you don't know any of this is going on. You're
No,
thinking
right.
you're keeping
And so,
alone.
right. And, in my mind, this is weird, but that night, I still remember this, that night, we were supposed to have dinner with this couple, right, in town. My first thought was, oh no, someone should let this couple know I can't go to dinner. This is like,
Isn't it bizarre, the things you
mind.
think? Yeah, it's so bizarre. Yeah, but you're I think that's a survival instinct for sure.
Yeah.
You
So
know,
that's weird. But imagine this. So Clifton's in that prison administration thing. And I only found this out later, much later, but because Clifton would say, well, one of the inmates, because see, when everything's locked down, if you're a porter, like one of those cleaning porter guys, inmate in the administration building, you can't go anywhere either. So you're there. And so one of those guys told Cliff, look, if they don't get him, we will. Which means like the inmates had already made the decision that if the SWAT team, or like the prison wouldn't handle it, and somehow the inmate lived, that they already had a contract, they were going to kill him.
right.
Because he had broke the code for
Yes.
the old convicts. And then on top of it, this is so, it's like crazy. There's the main prison yard. There's the minimum security camp next to the yard.
Yep.
At the minimum security camp,
Mm-hmm.
there is a Vietnamese guy who was a Viet Cong guy, who was a tunnel rat guy. Okay, now imagine this. So this guy, he hears what's going on, but he can escape with anything. He's the type of guy who can climb 2 fence lines, go through concertina wire. Nobody knows that he's done it, and come back. So what he would do is he would escape. I mean, during this situation, he went over the concertina wire, checking everything out. Then he would run, which is at least a mile or so. He would run and to the, and let the other inmate know in the administration office what was going on.
Oh my God.
Right, yeah. And I mean, it's just wild to think that, this Vietnamese guy could have, escaped prison anytime he wanted, but that wasn't his thing. It was just that, I mean, he had a short sentence. He wasn't going to go anywhere, but there was no way you're going to keep that type of person, in a minimum security camp. So he actually went over the fence line to let people know what was going on. I only found out about that many years later.
Now, did anybody realize that you had been raped? And did they tell Clifton?
Well, see, the thing is, they had no way of knowing, right?
Okay.
So they had no way of knowing. Now, when they got me out with the concussion grades, the assault teams, and basically the SWAT team ended up sort of blowing up the room sort of thing. And when they came in, they blew away the inmate. Okay. Now he was supposedly coming up at them with, a knife, right? So they just went pop, 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 pop. And then there's another guy in a flak jacket sort of dragging me over the body. And then when I'm being dragged down the hall, I hear a single shot. Now, I think they gave him a headshot. The SWAT team people say, no, he was just nervous when he reholstered. Yeah, well, okay, whatever. But when I'm dragged out, they had already called in EMTs, like for ambulance, because they didn't know what to expect. And I didn't want anybody to touch me. You know what I mean? Zero. And, here I am on top of it, a doctor, and I'm basically telling medical people, get away from me. I'm okay, get away from me. Just boom, get away from me. And they weren't going to argue with a doctor.
Yeah.
Right. And also someone who is walking and talking and looks intact, right? And Clifton was there and he hugged me, thank God. But then we had to go over to the warden's office because I had a female warden, thankfully, at that time. She was a good person. And she said, Karen, we have, this is procedure, we have to debrief you. Like they wanted to know whatever. I wasn't ready for it at all.
No.
I was like in shock, basically, for all sorts of, especially that grenade thing. I think my brain was still bouncing around in my head. And so I go to the warden's area and she said, I'll just have my secretary here. And do you want your husband with you? Well, I wasn't going to let him go then, So here's the four of us in a room, and she had to do her job, but she was also compassionate. She knew I was rattled. So the questions she would ask, I was just doing like yes or no answers, Nobody asked me if I had been raped or, you know what I mean? It was more like security questions, generic sort of stuff. I don't even remember what I said. All what I know is I didn't go there. And then after that, Clifton drove me home because I didn't want to drive in my car. And then there's the media, out there with all those media type of people. And I did not want to in any way interact with media because I had seen circumstances where the media would get a little piece and it had nothing to do with really what happened. So I didn't want any, so I didn't interact with the media at all. I had been contacted by the media where they wanted my story, but I never told them anything because I wasn't ready and that just wasn't it. So I get home and then I'm so wired, I can't sleep at all. And that's when I did what my German mother taught me. I scrubbed and cleaned all the rooms in my house. And I went back to work on Monday.
Holy crap. And this was like a 10-hour hostage
Yes, 10
situation.
hours.
You were in there for 10 hours, assaulted, raped. The SWAT team sledgehammers through the wall,
Right.
uses the concussion grenade, kills the inmate in front of you, drags you over them. So maybe you need a little time to.
Yeah, right.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah,
So,
but I
go back to work Monday, like it's no big deal.
I just go back to work. Yeah. And they weren't really, I don't, first of all, they never checked on me, and of course, this is the days before, internet stuff, but I mean, no one had, done a phone call or anything, but I just show up to work and I don't think they knew exactly what to say. So they didn't really say anything. And they hadn't cleaned up my room really. I mean, in that there was a big hole still in the wall, because that takes construction people to heal the wall up. And it had been cleaned, but when you stepped on the tiles, there was still blood that gushed up, from the tiles, which was not good for me. And there were still bullet hole thingies in the screen and the wall, which is also not good for me. So
no, a lot of trauma triggers. I mean,
right.
a million and one trauma triggers. There's
right. So in one of the things I did was I immediately made the decision that, and thankfully I had a female warden, but I called up the office and said, you got to fix the hole in that wall. And so thankfully they jumped on that, the next day or two, because anything to fix in a prison could take forever. And it's like mid-October and Nevada's cold, up in northern Nevada, right? But I actually got permission to get a carpet, and I put down a carpet on the tiles, you know what I mean? So I didn't have to see them. And then I changed the position of the desk because I realized the way my desk was positioned, I had to get around it to get out the door. And I wanted to make sure in the future I was closer to the door than technically the inmate was if I was seeing them. You see what I mean? So
Yep.
I changed the position of it into a more secure position. And in those days, you know, my office also doubled as the exam room. So
Yep.
it was just sort of weird.
And no one ever really asked you about rape. And people have to understand, this is back in '89. And it's not like people had no sensitivity back then, but it was a different atmosphere. There was no internet. Much different atmosphere towards women, not like the '70s, but rape. You kind of, I mean, I know I'm thinking about this timeline, and that was stuff you didn't talk about really.
Right. Yeah.
In my mind, you dealt with it, and it took you several weeks to even tell Clifton.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
What actually, now a lot of that is like you just went through a very traumatic thing. Maybe you just need a minute.
Right. Yeah. No, I was in shock, and I realized that I had a problem where I think it was like maybe my second week back to work, and I always worked out in the gym, and I continued to exercise is one of my things that helps me be mentally okay. So I still went to the gym every morning, and I think a week or so afterwards, some woman in the gym who's a regular, though I didn't really know her well, but she's a regular, she came up to me and she said, "Oh, I heard what happened to you, and I'm so glad nothing happened to you whatsoever." and then because in the paper they didn't know. They were like, "Well, doc, this happens to the doctor and she's back at work." And in the prison was like, "Well, she was a little stunned, but nothing happened to her." You see what I mean? Because I didn't tell him, remember?
Yeah.
Right, I didn't tell him.
Yeah, I'm glad that you had a 10-hour hostage situation and watched a guy get blown to bits.
Yeah, I know.
And lived through a concussion grenade, but like that's it. That's all that you.
I know, right? And so when she said that, I snapped and I said, "No, nothing happened to me except I was held hostage, assaulted, raped, concussion grenades, saw the guy blown away." But I just went like I vomited on this poor woman, and the look on her face was like, "Oh my God!" She didn't know what to say either, but she moved away from me. Like she just moved away and went on a different gym equipment.
You don't want to be contagious,
Right. Right. And then I realized, wow. All right, I've got a problem here. And I tried still trying to stuff it down. And then I started getting colds and sniffles, which I just never really got. And then, medically in my brain, I know, oh man, my immune system is having issues. And then at that time we actually had a medical director at that time. This is a year and a half after I started. And I asked him, for a little, what should I say? I asked him for advice. And he said, "Well, why don't you talk to the psychiatrist here?" Now, that was the worst advice possible because that guy was as crazy as a Looney Tune. I mean, truly, that guy was a crazy guy. And so that was like, there's no way I'm going to talk to someone who I know is basically crazy. And then someone told me, "Oh, there's a female psychiatrist in town who's a normal person." And I thought, okay, Karen, get over yourself. Why don't you just talk to her once? And I talked to her. And in the first meeting, I still remember where she pointed out that I had not even allowed myself to become angry. And that was something like almost a realization for me, because I know growing up in my family, you weren't really allowed to show anger. actually weren't really allowed to show too much emotions at all. You sort of just didn't really show emotions unless it was happy. Happy was okay, but not but not anger and not depression, or none of the negative emotions were really acceptable. And that was a realization for me that I experienced anger because it was basically a threat. And also it was an injustice and an insult, sort of all the triggers for anger. And when I realized that, I realized that I had to work through that. And to me, I did that. And one of the ways, well, one of the ways it ultimately worked out for me was, so I had that realization with a psychiatrist, and then I went on vacation by myself, skiing in Vail, Colorado, where I had a wonderful time. And I thought, okay, Karen, I'm back, like I'm back to my normal self. Not really, but a year later, I was asked, there was a in-service training for custody officers, and I, at that time, this is the late 80s, I'm giving these talks on HIV to custody, because they had all these concerns about HIV and AIDS in those days. And one of the young female officers, mind you, these are new officers, she raises her hand and says, "Oh, Dr. Gedney, we heard you were hostage. Can you tell us about that?" Now, mind you, up on that point of time, no one in the prison ever had asked what had happened to me or what I felt or anything. Zero. And when that was about a year later, so now I've got my marbles and I have anger now. and then I basically told them. And that poor class was probably never the same. Yeah, because there were women crying, and then there's always a couple of guys who basically said that Dr. Gedney, is a problem. You should get rid of her, that sort of too. But
right, because you don't want to make waves in the prison system.
Right. Yeah. And
now,
but fortunately, the instructor for the class, CJ, had been a Korean and a Vietnam vet. And he realized that, one, it was the best thing for me, but two, he also realized it was the best thing for custody officers to hear, because he understood that, like in war times, the worst thing is to make believe it never happened and just stuff it down, right? That sort of thing. So he fortunately was one of the good guys.
Now, I'm going to fast forward, because your whole platform and what you're doing now is to inspire people and help them be their best selves. And I guess it's shocking for me. You stayed your book's called 30 Years Behind Bars. You stayed as a prison doctor for 30 years. And Clifton ended up being a teacher and volunteer because he was such a good man, a professional male role model, very smart.
Right.
Like you said, he had been a platoon leader, so he probably understood some of what the inmates were going through. You guys stayed in the prison system. You were there as a doctor for 30 years.
Yeah.
Even though a year and a half in, what gave you the ability to stay?
The biggest thing for me was, after the hostage incident, it was the compassion from the inmates in what they said, the compassion in their notes to me, and also to experience compassion from a group where most people would least expect it from. And then in contrast, where you tend to expect something from your people that you work with, who are supposedly the pillars of society or the protectors of society, and they have none, or I felt none. And when you experience that, it really changed the way I looked at the world, I must say. But also it showed me the value, to me, it showed me the value and potential in that population that was being thrown away. And
Right.
and also that in that population, there's a spectrum.
Mhm.
There are people who are just in the wrong place, the wrong time, all the way to people who are very dangerous and you don't really want them in society. But they're not all the same. That's the thing. They're not all the same. And and of course, as a physician, you want to figure things out and you want to help heal people and make them whole. And you hate seeing human potential wasted. And I always wanted to make an impact. And to me, to make an impact in a place where most people weren't interested in making an impact. So I knew that my greatest, what should I say, my greatest gift would be in the darkest place. And I don't want to go darker than a prison. Like, I don't want to go to, I don't know, like some dark prison in the Middle Eastern country or something, you know.
Yeah, it could definitely be worse, but this is pretty up there. And
Right. Yeah.
wow.
So I wanted to make an impact in a place where I felt I was needed.
And I know that when we were writing to each other before, you said it's a system that wants to punish and shame. And like you said, there are people that should be there that are dangerous, that you don't want to get out, that you don't want to interact with. But you're seeing the whole prison system is the job, or their directive is to punish and shame. There's no healing or making whole or rehabilitating, because 90% of those people are going to come back out.
Right.
But while they're there, you wanted to make some difference in their healing process, so when they got out, they could maybe be successful, which wouldn't we want that?
Right. Right. And I had hope for them. See, the thing is, it's the typical sort of thing where I was energized when, let's say, an inmate left and did well. I loved those stories. I mean, I loved the underdog stories. And I was surrounded by people who were very attached to tell stories about how an inmate left and screwed up and came back. That energized them, because it's that confirmation bias where you look for the things that confirm your underlying value system, right? And I value the underdog winning. And there's some people who value uh, their mindset that a leopard does not change their spots. And I think to think that humans can't change is very limiting.
And like you said, there are times that people are definitely in the wrong place at the wrong time, or it's very situational. Holy cow, Karen. So you stayed 30 years. Clifton was supportive. You did end up telling him about the incident a couple weeks ago. What was that like? When, I mean, not a couple weeks ago, a couple weeks after it happened. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah.
What was that conversation like? Because I think it seems to me from our emails that was a more limited conversation.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I remember, it took me maybe 2 weeks or so to tell him. And I remember we were lying in bed, and I sort of nudged toward that topic. And I knew that he had already, what should I say, in his mind, he had already known it had happened.
Yeah.
And he was just waiting for me to tell him. That was the thing. And he basically just held me and told me that it would get that he cared for me, right? So, and the thing is that I knew he wasn't the type of guy to, I don't know, like somehow blame me and then look at me as less. You see what I mean? That sort of thing.
So he just kind of let you process it, gave you the space, and let you talk.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. So 30 years afterwards, you retire from that and you finally write the book. And I want to, that just came out a month ago. So this is all very new. And I've written a book. So I know when you write a book and you have to talk to people about the past or about the role they played, it's very powerful for the author, for you reaching out. And you and Clifton had another conversation when you were writing the book, and
Right.
because you wanted to know what he remembered and how it affected him. And what was that like 30 years later, almost?
Well, yeah, it's interesting to find out that you still learn things 30 years later about an incident because you choose to revisit it. And the profound thing for me was when I asked him, well, remembering it, how did it really affect you? And he said, Karen, that's the first time you've really asked me that. And that just like floored me, because I realized, was I that blind or that sort of stuck in my own little head, or did I misremember? And he made the comment, he said, when I looked at Vietnam vets and PTSD, and he said, and I had my own PTSD, and it took me a while to process my stuff. And he said, I realized that people aren't really getting over it until they start asking how their behavior affects other people.
How interesting.
Which is it was like a very interesting insight for me as a doctor, because I realized how true that statement really is. Because you've healed yourself enough to get outside of your little pain ball to then ask other people, how it affected them. And it's sort of like one of those things where I realized it, but there's a difference between realizing it and then asking them in a way where they can share their stuff. Because I think initially you got so much of your own stuff, you don't want to hear other people's stuff. And then on top of it, I was still a doctor in a prison where I have to process all my patients' pain every day, all sorts of stuff, like they're dying or they've got some miserable illness or their kids died in the outside world and their guilt. So I was constantly getting this stuff all the time.
So now, holy cow. First of all, anyone can get your book on Amazon, 30 Years Behind Bars, which of course I want to run and go get. We went through this interview planning process pretty quickly, so I wouldn't have even had time to get it.
Right.
Let alone read it. But 30 Years Behind Bars is there. And now, what's your plan now? Because now you've retired and you said you wanted to figure out what you're doing with your life.
Right.
So,
yes, yeah, I am.
Because you haven't lived enough already, Your business is DRG Consulting. So what's the easiest way for people to find you? And what can you do for people when they find you? I mean, like me, they can just get you on the podcast and question the hell out of you. But
right.
What about outside of that?
Well, I have a website called discoverdrg.com.
Okay.
And through that website, they can take a look at, the book, my blogs, how to contact me, and also for potential speaking engagements, things like that. I think that's the best way to contact me. And then, of course, with my book, if they like it, I really want them to leave a review and share it with other people, because I'm operating at the grassroots level. I did not go and get publicists and agents and things like that. One, I didn't know, but two, I'm still stuck a bit in that mindset of doing things on my own.
Yeah, me too. My book's been out 1.5 years, and people are like, oh, you're a published author, it must be so great. And I don't know what we think. I never thought about what it would be like to be a published author. I didn't think all of a sudden I'd have fame and I'd be signing autographs somewhere. But
Right.
it's like, it's nothing like that. I'm like, I
Yeah.
make maybe $2 off of every book I sell.
Right, I know.
Like, J.K. Rowling's and I are not in the same category.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of, it's great to do it on your own, but yeah, you're grassroots for a long time when you do that. And I think I mean, for me, and I am guessing for you, you think if people read this and it helps somebody, if somebody learns something, if it makes their life a little bit better, then it was a job well done.
Right.
You know?
And also, I also wrote the book because I really wanted to inspire people to also take a look at this mass incarceration thing, and to inspire them to take their passion, whatever it may be, and think about it in a way, how could they use to help reduce mass incarceration? For example, there's so many kids that come from really dysfunctional environments. And if people have a passion for dance or art or sports or whatever it is, to think of themselves as, if they help a kid, maybe that's one less person that ends up behind bars. Or if they're a lot of the baby boomers who are, starting to shift careers or think about, what am I going to do in retirement? I really think they need something that is just really purpose driven to give back. And there's all these interesting prison entrepreneurial programs that are popping up. There's the people that are the dog lovers and the horse lovers who have these puppies on parole programs in prison, or Nevada has the Mustang program. But you can take your love of dogs and then be helping with the dog program in the prison. Some people are trainers, some people buy the dogs, some people support the program. But to me, instead of whining about problems in our country, I want to inspire people to take a little action, but do it in a way that they enjoy. There's some people who enjoy knitting. They had the inmates crocheting things in the prison, making cat baskets and stuff. I mean, there are different things that can be done.
I love that. That's a great space to end on, that you can take whatever you're interested in and still give back.
And give back, right. And to me, it makes really a lot of sense to give back to someone that, if you change their direction of life, you can make such a ripple effect, because it's not only does that person not go to prison, but their behavior doesn't hurt others. So it keeps society safer. And then they become productive. So instead of paying all the money in prisons, like California example, in the last 20 years has built 22 prisons in 2 universities. As you see the difference. Yeah. And in our type of country, you shouldn't have 5% of the population in the world and 25% of the incarcerated in the world. That is not a statistic that this country should be proud of. And it should be so glaring, people should ask, wait a second, if this is the land of the free, land of liberty and freedom and happiness, how did we end up like that?
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people on both sides of the polarized political system who actually think, wait a second, we need to think about this differently.
And we do.
And then they have to, besides thinking, they have to do some act, they have to do something, act. Right.
And thank you for inspiring people to do that. Thank you for sharing your story and your business and your book. And holy cow, it was just a pleasure interviewing you, and for your willingness to be open. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening in to Jen Taylor Rerouting. Like, share, and of course, comment. I welcome input with attitude. Get a copy of my book on Amazon, Hello, My Name is Warrior Princess, or check out my website, jentaylor.net. And if you still want more, sign up for one of my coaching packages.